You were never mine. Do you hear me, Avery? You were never my blood. The words hit harder than the slam of the front door that followed. For a few seconds, Avery just stood there, her hands trembling, her breath catching halfway between anger and disbelief. The old floorboards of that Los Angeles house had heard arguments before, but nothing like this. Her mother didn't say a word. She just stood by the sink, staring into a cup of cold coffee as if the truth was floating somewhere inside it. Avery waited for her to say something, anything, but silence screamed louder than her father's voice ever could. When her stepfather, Frank, left that night, he didn't just walk out of the house. He walked out of her life, leaving behind a box. A small, dusty box with her name written across it in his sharp, uneven handwriting. Inside it, a truth waited that would destroy everything Avery believed about who she was. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. Avery Darnell had always known that her family wasn't perfect, but she believed they were real. She grew up in a modest home in the Echo Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, the kind of place where neighbors shared lemons from their trees and complained about parking in the same breath. Frank Darnell, her stepfather, wasn't warm, but he was steady. He paid the bills, fixed what broke, and called her kid when he was in a decent mood. But over time, something in him hardened. After Avery finished college, the arguments became more frequent, mostly about money, responsibility, and the way she was living her life. She had taken a job as a freelance writer, something Frank called playing pretend for pennies. That evening, the fight started over something small, an unpaid power bill. But the way Frank snapped, it felt like years of resentment finally broke loose. He shouted things he couldn't take back, and then came that one sentence, "You were never my blood." At first, Avery thought it was just cruelty, something he said out of spite. But the look in her mother's eyes said otherwise. Marlene couldn't even look at her. Her lips quivered, and she muttered something about how, it doesn't matter, he didn't mean it, but Avery knew. She'd spent her entire life reading between her mother's silences. This one screamed of guilt. That night, after Frank stormed out, Avery sat on the living room floor, staring at the small wooden box he'd left behind. It looked like something pulled from the back of a closet, old, scratched, and wrapped in memories no one wanted to touch. Her hands hesitated, her chest tight. Inside, there were photos, most of them from when she was a toddler. She noticed something odd about one of them. In the corner, the date read 1999, but her birth certificate said she was born in 1998. Under the photos was a faded hospital wristband with a name she didn't recognize. Ilara Quinn. At first, she thought maybe Frank had mixed up someone else's belongings, but then she found a newspaper clipping folded neatly under the wristband. It was yellowed, fragile, the kind of thing you only keep if it means something. The headline made her heart pound. Baby Ilara Quinn missing from Missouri hospital, parents desperate for answers. The photo in the article showed a baby with wide eyes and a small tuft of dark hair. It could have been anyone, but something about the photo felt familiar. The shape of the eyes, maybe. Or the small dimple near the corner of her mouth, the same one Avery saw in her reflection every morning. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet. Avery sat there on the floor, the article shaking in her hands, her mind running in circles. If she wasn't Frank's child, and if her mother wasn't telling her everything, then who was she? She tried to remember her earliest memories, but everything before age 4 was fog. Just flashes of hospital rooms, beeping sounds, and a woman humming, a voice she couldn't place. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat awake until dawn, scrolling through old archives on her laptop, searching the name Ilara Quinn. The internet held bits and fragments, a grieving family, TV interviews from decades ago, and an old photograph of a mother holding her child on a hospital lawn. That mother's name was Lydia Quinn, the same name on the wristband tag. Avery felt a strange pull in her chest, like something inside her already knew the truth long before her mind did. The next morning, she confronted her mother. Marlene denied everything at first, called it nonsense, said Frank was just being cruel. But the way she avoided Avery's eyes told another story. When Avery pressed harder, Marlene's voice cracked. "You're my daughter. You always will be," she said. But Avery didn't miss the tremor in her voice when she added, "That's all that matters." But it did matter. Every second of her life up to this point had been built on a lie. A carefully constructed story that had begun to crumble with one outburst from a man she barely recognized anymore. Later that evening, Avery packed a small bag and sat in her car outside the house. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she couldn't stay. She opened the box again, staring at the photo of the baby, at the newspaper clipping, and at the faint hospital logo on the wristband, Mercy St. Joseph's Hospital, St. Louis, Missouri. Avery took a deep breath. Somewhere out there, a family had lost a child. Somewhere out there, someone had lived with a wound that never closed. Maybe that missing piece was her. As the sun began to set over Los Angeles, painting the sky in gold and gray, Avery made a decision. She was going to Missouri. Not because she wanted to destroy her mother's life, but because she couldn't live hers without knowing the truth. That night, she whispered to herself, "If I was stolen, I need to know why. And if I wasn't, I need to know who I am." And for the first time in her life, the truth scared her more than the lies ever had. Sometimes, it takes losing your entire sense of identity to realize how fragile the idea of family really is. If you've ever looked at your life and wondered whether everything you were told was true, you'll understand Avery's silence that night. It's stories like these that remind us why truth matters, even when it hurts. The drive from Los Angeles to Missouri felt longer than any distance Avery had ever traveled. Not just in miles, but in the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. Each state line she crossed felt like peeling back another layer of her own history, one she never knew existed. She stopped in small towns along the way, Bakersfield, Flagstaff, Amarillo, places that all looked the same after a while, quiet and forgettable. But her thoughts were anything but quiet. She kept looking at that photo of the missing baby taped to her dashboard, the edges curling from wear. The eyes looking back at her seemed to ask the same question she'd been avoiding. Who am I really? By the time Avery arrived in St. Louis, Missouri, the air was colder, sharper, as if it carried the kind of truth she wasn't ready to breathe in yet. The city felt foreign, not just in landscape but in spirit. Her first stop was Mercy St. Joseph's Hospital, the name printed on the wristband she'd found in the box. The building had changed over the years, but its walls still held the same weight of memory, the kind of place where joy and grief shared the same hallways. She walked up to the front desk, clutching her purse tightly, unsure of what she was even looking for. The woman behind the counter gave her a polite smile, the kind you give someone who's clearly searching for something they may never find. Avery explained she was researching an old missing persons case, from 1999. The clerk's smile faltered slightly. After a few minutes, she returned with a thin folder. Inside, Avery found a brief report, the night Elara Quinn went missing. The nurse on duty was listed as Marlene Brooks, her mother's maiden name. A chill ran through Avery's spine. She closed the folder, her heart pounding. The date of the disappearance matched exactly with the year she had appeared in her own baby photos, 1999. Not 1998 as she'd always been told. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. For the next few days, Avery spent hours combing through library archives and public records, piecing together fragments of the Quinn family's tragedy. Lydia and Robert Quinn had been a young couple, local business owners who lost everything after their daughter vanished. Their case had gone cold after 2 years, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a photo that now haunted Avery every time she closed her eyes. At night, she stayed in a small motel near downtown, unable to sleep. The hum of the air conditioner and the distant traffic outside were the only things keeping her from breaking completely. Every memory from childhood now felt like a puzzle piece that didn't belong. She remembered being 4 years old and asking her mother why she didn't have any baby pictures before that age. Marlene had said they'd been lost in a fire. Now she knew there had never been a fire. There had just been lies. On her 4th day in Missouri, Avery visited a local records office. She asked for her birth certificate, the one listed under the name Avery Darnell. The clerk hesitated as she typed on her computer. "Huh," she muttered. This was reissued in 2002, original documents missing. Avery leaned closer. Reissued? Why? The clerk shrugged. Could have been adoption-related, could have been a clerical thing. Hard to say. But deep down, Avery already knew it was neither clerical nor innocent. As she left the building, she noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench near the courthouse, feeding pigeons. He looked up as she passed and said something that stopped her cold. "You've got her eyes." Avery turned back. "Whose eyes?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man tilted his head. "Lydia Quinn's girl. Ilara. You look just like her." For a long moment, Avery couldn't breathe. The world around her felt like it was spinning too fast. She wanted to ask him more, but he was already standing, brushing crumbs from his jacket. He said he'd lived nearby when the baby went missing. Everyone in town had followed the case. Lydia used to walk the park every morning with a picture of her daughter, handing out flyers until there was nothing left to hand out, just hope that never quite died. Avery thanked him and sat on the bench after he left, staring out at the pigeons fluttering across the gray winter sky. For the first time, she felt something shift inside her, not just fear, but belonging. Maybe not to the family she knew, but to a story that was bigger than her own life. That evening, Avery returned to her motel room and laid everything out on the bed. The wristband, the article, the photo, the hospital records. The evidence was undeniable. Marlene had been there. Her stepfather had known. The people she had trusted most had been part of something she didn't even have the language to name. But one question still echoed louder than all the rest. Why? Why would her mother take someone else's child? And how had they lived with it for 25 years? She sat in silence, her hands pressed to her face, trying to hold back tears. The pain wasn't just about being lied to, it was the realization that her entire life had been borrowed. As she looked again at the photograph of Lydia Quinn holding her baby, Avery felt a strange mixture of grief and compassion. That woman had lost everything, and somewhere along the way, Avery had been raised to believe she was someone else entirely. The next morning, she decided to confront the past directly. She found a small private investigator's office listed online, someone who specialized in missing persons cases. When she handed the investigator her documents, he studied them quietly. Then he looked up and said, "If what you're saying is true, you're not looking for answers. You're looking for closure." Avery nodded. "I just need to know the truth." He promised to contact her in a few days after running a cross-state database search. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about her mother. About what kind of love leads a person to cross that line, to take what isn't theirs. Maybe Marlene had done something terrible, but part of Avery still remembered the woman who held her through every fever, every heartbreak. The woman who called her sweetheart, even when they were fighting. Was that love fake too? Or did love and guilt coexist in the same breath? 3 days later, Avery's phone buzzed while she was sitting alone in a diner off Interstate 44. The investigator's number flashed across the screen. When she answered, his tone was different, cautious. He said he'd found something in the National Missing Persons database. The DNA match. Avery's heart stopped. The investigator hesitated before saying the name aloud. "Lydia Quinn," he said quietly. "She's alive, and she's been looking for you." Avery's drive back to Los Angeles felt heavier than the one that brought her to Missouri. She had come chasing answers, but now every mile back home felt like dragging the weight of 2 lives behind her, the one she'd lived and the one that had been stolen from her. The investigator's words still echoed in her head. "Lydia Quinn is alive, and she's been looking for you." Avery hadn't called her yet. She couldn't. Not until she confronted the woman who had raised her, the woman she now knew wasn't really her mother. When she pulled into her old neighborhood, the palm trees lining the street looked almost foreign. Everything familiar now felt counterfeit. The little yellow house on the corner, her childhood home, sat quiet, the curtains drawn halfway, as if hiding something inside. Marlene was in the garden, clipping dead roses from the bush Avery's stepfather had planted years ago. She looked smaller somehow, her hair thinner, her hands trembling slightly. When she saw Avery's car, her face lit up with that same warm smile, the one that had comforted Avery since she was a child. But this time, it didn't comfort her. It broke her. She stood by the gate for a long moment, watching the woman who had once been her whole world. Then, without saying a word, she stepped inside. Marlene asked how her trip went, her voice shaky but cheerful. Avery couldn't answer. She just handed her the folder, the hospital documents, the missing person report, the photo of Lydia Quinn. For a moment, Marlene's smile froze. Then it fell. Her knees gave out slightly as she sat down on the garden bench, her hands trembling so hard the papers slipped through her fingers. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to. She just whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen this way." Avery stood there, feeling 1,000 emotions at once: anger, betrayal, heartbreak, and something deeper, pity. Marlene explained in a voice so soft it barely carried over the wind. 25 years ago, she had been a nurse at Mercy St. Joseph's Hospital. One night, she'd found an abandoned baby in there, or at least, that's what she'd thought. The child had been brought in during chaos, no identification, no one claiming her. And something in Marlene, a woman who had just lost her own baby to a miscarriage, broke that night. She told herself she was rescuing that little girl. That she was giving her a life, a home, a future. She never meant to steal someone's child. But by the time she realized what she'd done, it was too late to undo it. Avery felt the air leave her lungs. All her life, she'd believed she was loved because she belonged. Now she realized she was loved because she filled a void. Marlene's eyes filled with tears. She said she had lived every day in fear, terrified someone would find out, terrified Avery would hate her. "I didn't take you to hurt anyone," she whispered. "I took you because I couldn't live without you." Avery wanted to scream, to demand how love could ever justify a crime. But instead, she just stood there in silence. Because despite everything, she could see the truth in her mother's eyes, the kind of love that destroyed itself to survive. Later that night, Avery sat in her old bedroom, staring at the ceiling she'd once decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars. Everything felt smaller now, the room, the memories, even the love. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Because love, in all its brokenness, still tethered her to this woman. Sometimes the hardest truth isn't the one that hurts you, it's the one that makes you understand the person who did. If you've ever loved someone who hurt you, if you've ever had to forgive just to breathe again, then take a moment before you scroll away. Because stories like this remind us, love is never as simple as right or wrong. It's just human. Plus, subscribe, not for me, but for the truth that people like Avery spend their whole lives trying to find. The next morning, Avery finally found the courage to make the call she'd been avoiding. Lydia Quinn's voice on the other end was calm, gentle, trembling with disbelief. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lydia whispered her name, "Here." Avery froze. It was the first time she'd ever heard someone call her that. Lydia told her she had never stopped searching. That even when everyone said her daughter was gone, she'd kept one room in the house exactly the same, untouched for 25 years. Tears ran down Avery's face. She wanted to believe it, but part of her was still numb. She agreed to meet Lydia the following week in Los Angeles. But that night, before she could rest, there was a knock on the door. Her stepfather stood there, his face grave, holding an envelope. He said there was something Avery needed to see, something he should have shown her long ago. He handed her the envelope, his eyes heavy with guilt. When she opened it, her hands began to shake. Inside was a single photo, Marlene holding her as a baby, standing in front of the hospital's nursery window. The date stamped on the back was the very night Ilara Quinn disappeared. Avery looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "You knew." He didn't deny it. He just said, "I was trying to protect you both." That night, Avery couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk, the photo lying in front of her, the truth sitting heavier than ever. If her mother had stolen her, and her stepfather had covered it up, then who had she really been all these years? Their daughter, or their secret? And when she met Lydia Quinn, would that truth set her free, or destroy everything she still had left? The drive to Lydia Quinn's home in Los Angeles felt unreal. Avery's hands gripped the steering wheel, the city skyline blurring in the distance. Every block she passed carried a new wave of fear. What if Lydia wasn't what she imagined? What if this was another lie? When she arrived, she sat in her car for several minutes, watching the house from across the street. It was a modest home, painted soft cream with a front porch lined with wind chimes. It looked peaceful, too peaceful for a place that had been frozen in grief for 25 years. Then the front door opened. A woman stepped out slowly, mid-50s, graying auburn hair, gentle but haunted eyes. Lydia Quinn. She stood there for a long moment, as if she somehow knew Avery was outside before she even saw her. Avery got out of the car. The world seemed to slow. Neither of them spoke as they met halfway down the walkway. Lydia lifted a trembling hand, touching Avery's face like she was afraid she might disappear if she blinked. It wasn't a cinematic reunion, no dramatic music, no shouting or tears spilling instantly. It was quiet, painfully quiet, the kind of silence that carries every word that's been waiting to be said for decades. Inside, Lydia poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from her, not as strangers, but as something undefined. She began talking slowly, like someone learning to use their voice again. She described the night her baby vanished from the hospital nursery. How the security footage was grainy, how no one noticed the woman in scrubs who walked out the side door. Lydia said she'd spent years putting up flyers, knocking on doors, showing pictures to anyone who would look. But people stopped listening after a while. She never remarried. Never moved away. She said every time the wind rustled through that empty nursery window, she imagined her daughter's laugh. Avery listened in silence, tears pooling in her eyes but never falling. She wanted to feel something stronger, joy, relief, but mostly she felt disoriented. She was hearing about a life that should have been hers, but wasn't. She looked around the house and saw photos of a little girl, birthdays, Christmas mornings, dance recitals, but every photo stopped at age 2. After that, the frames were empty, replaced by candles. For the first time, Avery realized just how much had been stolen from both of them. That evening, Lydia brought out a small wooden box. Inside were keepsakes, a baby blanket, a hospital wristband, a lock of hair sealed in a bag. She said she had never opened it since the day her daughter disappeared. Now, she wanted Avery to take it. Avery's hands trembled as she lifted the blanket. She didn't remember it, but it smelled faintly of something familiar, lavender detergent. It was the same scent Marlene always used on laundry. The 2 women sat in silence again, but this time it was softer. Lydia didn't try to claim Avery. She didn't beg for forgiveness or demand love. She simply said, "I just want to know the woman you became." And in that moment, Avery realized she didn't have to choose between the woman who raised her and the woman who lost her. Both were part of her story. Both had given her something, love, even if one had done it wrong. Before she left that night, Lydia handed her a small envelope. She said it was a letter she had written 20 years ago, meant to be read if her daughter was ever found. Avery took it but didn't open it yet. When she got back to her car, she sat there staring at the envelope under the dim streetlight. Her life had been split in 2, and no matter what she chose, someone would be left behind. As she started the car, her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end made her blood run cold. It wasn't Lydia. It wasn't Marlene. It was a man's voice, rough, deliberate, and eerily calm. He said, "You don't know the whole story, Avery. Your disappearance wasn't an accident." Then the line went dead. Avery sat frozen, the envelope still unopened in her lap, as the world around her felt suddenly dangerous again. Who was that man? And what secret could possibly be darker than being stolen as a child? That night, Avery couldn't sleep. The stranger's voice echoed in her head like a haunting refrain. "You don't know the whole story. Your disappearance wasn't an accident." The next morning, she drove straight to the police station in downtown Los Angeles. She asked to see the detective handling her case, a woman named Detective Shaw, who'd reopened her file after the DNA results came in. Shaw confirmed they'd traced the number that called her. It belonged to a prepaid phone, purchased just 3 days ago. Then Shaw leaned forward and told Avery something that made her stomach twist. There had been another file attached to her missing person record, one that had been sealed by court order 2 decades earlier. Avery was granted access as the legal victim. The file contained a series of old witness statements, photographs, and an internal report from a hospital investigation. At the center of it all was a name she knew, Marlene Brooks. According to the report, Marlene had worked part-time as a hospital custodian back in the 1990s, at the very same facility where Lydia Quinn's baby had gone missing. Avery sat frozen as she read line after line. Marlene had been struggling through an abusive marriage at the time. Her husband had taken their newborn son and left her with nothing. She'd been seen near the maternity ward the night of the abduction but was never charged. The evidence was inconclusive. It suddenly made sense. Marlene hadn't been some random woman who wanted to hurt a child. She'd been broken, desperate, and grieving. When she found that baby alone in the hospital corridor, she saw it as a miracle, a second chance to have the family she'd lost. Detective Shaw placed a comforting hand on Avery's shoulder and said softly, "What she did was wrong, but it came from pain, not malice." Avery sat there quietly, her eyes fixed on the report. Every memory she had of Marlene flashed through her mind. The nights she stayed up sewing Halloween costumes, the way she whispered bedtime stories about angels and second chances. She realized that, in her own fractured way, Marlene had loved her. Later that afternoon, Avery drove to the nursing home where Marlene was staying. The old woman's health had declined quickly in recent months. When Avery walked into the room, Marlene looked smaller than she remembered, frail, with oxygen tubes and trembling hands. She opened her eyes when she heard the footsteps. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. No words, no accusations. Just recognition. Finally, Avery sat beside her and took her hand. The warmth was still there, faint but real. She told Marlene she knew everything. About the hospital, the baby, the missing years. Marlene's eyes welled with tears, and her lips quivered as if to say something, but Avery stopped her. She said she wasn't there to hate her. She was there to thank her, for keeping her safe, for loving her the best she knew how, even when it came from something broken. Marlene's breathing grew shallow. Her voice was almost a whisper when she said, "I always knew this day would come. I prayed you'd understand someday, that I didn't steal you. I just couldn't let another baby go." Avery stayed until the end. Marlene passed peacefully that night, her hands still in hers. A week later, Avery stood in front of two gravestones, one belonging to Marlene Brooks, and the other, newly placed beside it, marking the resting spot for Baby Quinn, found at last. Lydia stood beside her, silent. There were no cameras, no crowds, just two women and a lifetime of pain quietly settling into peace. Avery realized she didn't belong to one family or the other, she belonged to both. The woman who lost her and the woman who raised her were both parts of the same truth. Love, no matter how flawed, leaves a mark that time cannot erase. When she looked up at the sky that day, she didn't feel lost anymore. She felt found. Sometimes, life gives us families we're born into, and sometimes, it gives us families we stumble into through pain, loss, or chance. But love, even broken love, still has meaning. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that forgiveness is possible even after the unthinkable, don't just move on. Take a second to subscribe. Not for me, but for every story out there that deserves to be heard before it's forgotten. Avery Quinn went on to start a foundation that helps reunite families separated by abductions and lost records. She named it Second Light, after the candle her mother once lit every night by the window, waiting for her child to come home. And somewhere in Los Angeles, when the wind blows softly through the city at night, it feels like both her mothers are finally at peace.